Disclaimer: the following program is designed to offend, provoke, and challenge your religious sensibilities. It contains content that will likely offend anyone who holds religion sacred. This is for those with thick skin or a taste for the harsh truth. If you're easily offended or cherish your religious views, please turn off now. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned. Welcome back to the second installment of Why This Argument is a Dumpster Fire. I'm kidding. Calm down. You guys are so serious. If you thought part one made some people squirm, strap into your computer chairs, because we're about to dive even deeper into the apologetic nonsense. This time, we're tackling P52, ossuaries, and the desperate attempt to make name frequencies somehow prove divine inspiration. Now, before we get started, let me be extremely clear. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to lay out the facts, expose the spin, and let you see just how much of this argument crumbles under actual scrutiny. Frankly, you can believe whatever you want. I really don't care. But if you're the type who enjoys critical thinking, welcome aboard. If you're here to rage in the comments, well, thanks for boosting engagement. Also, for full transparency, I can only include short clips of Wes Huff's video under fair use, and honestly, I might already be pushing it. So, if you want to see his full argument in context before I take it apart, I encourage you to watch his full video first. The link is in the description. That way, you can decide for yourself whether his claims hold up or completely fall apart. And of course, if you enjoy watching bad arguments get absolutely obliterated, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next round. All right, enough preamble, let's get into it. On part one, we stopped right before he started talking about the manuscript P52, so let's continue there.
And it's called P52, also known as John Ryland's 457. This manuscript is a fragment of the Gospel of John, which is only about the size of a credit card.
Here we go. P52, the apologists' favorite fragment. They love to parade this thing around like it's the smoking gun for early Christian writing. But let's expose the misleading framing here. What is P52? As he says, it's a tiny fragment containing only a few verses from John 18. It is not a full gospel. It doesn't even give us a complete passage, just snippets of words on both sides. It's a copy, not an original, meaning it still doesn't tell us when the Gospel of John was first written.
It was discovered in 1934 by an individual named C.H. Roberts.
He continues on here saying that it was found among other manuscripts brought over from places like Israel, Egypt, and Syria. So, quick note here, despite the common claim that Roberts discovered it in 1934, the fragment had been in the library's possession since Grenfell purchased it in 1920, which really doesn't matter to my arguments or his, frankly, just a note. But what he's telling is just background information that makes it sound like an important archaeological find, but it tells us nothing about biblical reliability. The fact that it was found among other manuscripts doesn't prove anything about the truthfulness of its content. Furthermore, the actual provenance of P52 is unknown since it was not scientifically excavated, but purchased from the antiquities market. Okay, so he goes on to say this.
Christians, however, for various reasons which we're still not entirely sure, very early adopted and preferred the use of the codex.
Then says Christians popularized using book form, then ends with this gem.
And the fact that it was probably from a codex, this outed it as a Christian writing.
This is misleading in several ways. The fact that it's from a codex does not prove anything about reliability. Yes, early Christians favored the codex over scrolls, but this has nothing to do with whether what they wrote was true. Just because a writing was in a codex doesn't mean it's historically accurate. Gnostic texts, apocryphal works, and other non-canonical writings were also found in codices. P52 does not confirm the early date of John's Gospel. Scholars date P52 anywhere from 125 to 175 CE, a wide range. Even if we accept the earlier end 125 CE, this is still several decades after John was supposedly written, C90 to 100 CE. This means P52 is not evidence for when John was originally composed, only that copies of it existed in Egypt by this time. Copies come after originals, meaning P52 doesn't prove that John's Gospel was early, it only proves that by the 2nd century, Christians were using it. P52 tells us nothing about textual stability. The fragment is too small to compare it meaningfully with later manuscripts. It does not allow us to see whether the text had changed over time. which is a massive gap in his argument. Saying the Christians preferred codices does not prove anything about the historical accuracy of the content. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, and other apocryphal works were also found in codex form. Should we therefore trust those as well? The codex was adopted by Christians because it was convenient, not because it confirmed the truth of their claims. This part of the video is pure apologetic fluff, designed to make P52 sound way more important than it actually is. What P52 actually tells us: a portion of John's Gospel was in circulation by the 2nd century. What P52 does not tell us: it does not tell us when John was originally written. It does not tell us whether John was historically accurate. It does not tell us whether John was copied accurately over time. So, why do apologists love P52 so much? Because it's one of the few pieces of manuscript evidence that seems early, but when you actually break it down, it proves almost nothing about the reliability of the Gospel of John.
Now, just about a century prior to Roberts making this discovery of P52, there was a man named Ferdinand Bauer in Germany who had come up with a theory.
Let me summarize this next part because it's not as relevant. The speaker claims that Ferdinand Bauer, a biblical scholar and student of Hegel, developed a theory in the 19th century that John's Gospel was written no earlier than 160 AD. He presents this as if Bauer's view was the dominant scholarly position until P52 shattered it. But this is misleading. Bauer was just one voice in a broader academic debate, and many scholars before P52 already placed John in the late 1st or early 2nd century. In fact, K.G. Bretschneider questioned John's apostolic authorship as early as the 1820s, and Adolf Jülicher noted in 1904 that scholars had been debating John's dating for decades. So no, P52 didn't prove anything new, it just became another piece of an already ongoing discussion. Now, a quick synopsis here before this next clip. He says that when P52 was identified as a Christian manuscript, it was sent to paleographers and papyrologists who unanimously dated it to the early 2nd century. Then he makes the obvious claim that copies come after originals, as if that's some groundbreaking revelation, before concluding that this somehow proves John's Gospel must have been written in the late 1st century.
P52 is coming at the beginning of the 2nd century, then John has to be in, at minimum, the end of the 1st century.
P52 proves no such thing. Yes, copies logically come after originals, but this does not mean there is only a short gap. A 2nd century copy does not require a 1st century original. It simply confirms that the text was in circulation by that time. If P52 dates to 125 to 150 CE, that does not mean John's Gospel was written in the late 1st century. It only means that a copy of John was circulating by the early to mid 2nd century. Since copies take time to spread, scholars infer that John must have been written earlier, but that does not pin it down to a specific date. The dating of P52 is not exact. Scholars estimate it to be from 125 to 175 CE, with some placing it closer to 150 CE. If we take a mid-2nd century date, that leaves open the possibility that John was written later than 100 CE. P52 does not definitively prove a 1st century date. It only shows that John was circulating in the 2nd century. The gap between the original and P52 is still significant. Even if he's right, and John was written in 90 to 100 CE, that's still 50 plus years after Jesus supposedly lived. That means John was not an eyewitness account. At best, it's a heavily theological retelling. So P52 did not prove John. Was written in the late 1st century, it only pushed back the earliest known copy. That's an important distinction, especially for this next part. Now, before the next clip, let's summarize what he's arguing here. He claims that even if we take the later possible date for P52, the time it takes for manuscripts to be written, copied, and spread means that John must have been written in the 1st century. Then he calls this a monumental discovery, saying it refocused perspectives and reaffirmed that John's Gospel was an early eyewitness testimony, as if P52 single-handedly restored John's credibility as a first-hand account. Essentially, he's saying P52 proves John is early and written by people who actually saw Jesus.
This was a monumental discovery because it completely refocused the perspectives of how the Gospel of John was read back to being early eyewitness testimony within the lifetime of the witnesses of those actual events.
This is absolute nonsense. Let's break down everything wrong with this claim. P52 did not overturn the scholarly consensus. As mentioned earlier, many scholars already placed John in the late 1st or early 2nd century before P52 was even found. P52 simply provided additional evidence. It didn't force scholars to rewrite history. P52 does not confirm John as an eyewitness account. The Gospel of John is not written in the first person, and nowhere does the author claim to be John. The book was anonymous in its earliest form. The traditional title, Gospel of John, was added later. John contains long speeches from Jesus, highly theological narratives, and unique stories missing from the synoptics, all signs of later theological development, not an eyewitness report. Even conservative scholars admit John was written decades after the events. John is typically dated to 90 to 100 CE, meaning it was written at least 50 plus years after Jesus supposedly lived, not by eyewitnesses. Even evangelical scholars acknowledge that John's gospel reflects theological development rather than a straightforward historical account. The majority of biblical scholars, except for this PhD student here, recognize that John was written with a theological agenda, not as a direct report of history. This claim is full of deliberate misrepresentations. It falsely claims that P52 proved John was written in the late 1st century, which is false. P52 only confirms that John was circulating in the early 2nd century. It falsely claims that P52 overturned the scholarly consensus, which is also false. There was already debate on John's dating before P52. It falsely claims that this confirms John as an eyewitness account. This is definitely false. John was written decades after the events and does not claim direct eyewitness authorship. The reality, P52 does not authenticate John's gospel as historical fact. It only confirms that copies existed in the 2nd century. This is in my opinion, an apologetic misrepresentation designed to make it seem like scholars were proven wrong, when in reality, the debate was already ongoing and P52 didn't change much. Quick synopsis here, since I can't show the whole video. He then introduces 3 archaeological sources: the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of Josephus, and Jewish ossuaries, as contextual evidence supporting the accuracy of biblical names. He further argues that onomastic congruence, or the matching of name frequencies to historical geography, demonstrates that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. According to him, the Gospel of Judas, which contains names common in 2nd and 3rd century Egypt, is unreliable because its names don't match 1st century Judea. Finally, he claims that Luke's use of rare names, such as Damaris and Lydia, proves that the New Testament accurately records real people and real events. He concludes that the Gospel authors intentionally preserved historical accuracy through the use of precise names, reinforcing the idea that their accounts are trustworthy. So let's look at some of these claims.
What these various sources do is they give us a frame of reference for the data of names.
All right, just to be clear, he's talking about the Jewish ossuaries, Josephus, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, saying they provide a frame of reference for names. This argument is irrelevant to the reliability of the New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain 0 references to Jesus or Christianity. They were written by an isolated Jewish sect, the Essenes, and are not evidence for the Gospels. Josephus was born after Jesus supposedly died, so his writings are not eyewitness testimony. His most famous passage mentioning Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum, is widely recognized as partially or entirely altered by later Christian scribes. Jewish ossuaries tell us about burial practices, but they do not confirm that Jesus was buried in a tomb, let alone that he resurrected. Even if the New Testament accurately describes burial customs, this does nothing to validate supernatural claims.
So onomastic congruence with the name frequency shows the trustworthiness of the New Testament.
This is a deceptive use of statistics, dressed up in academic jargon to make a weak argument sound impressive. Just because biblical names match 1st century Judea does not mean the events actually happened. Ancient writers frequently used real names and places in fiction, propaganda, and religious texts to create a sense of authenticity. A well-researched historical fiction novel about 19th century England will use real names, real locations, and real cultural details, but that doesn't mean Sherlock Holmes actually existed. The Quran and the Book of Mormon both contain historically accurate names. Does that suddenly validate Islam or Mormonism? Greek and Roman myths mention real historical figures and cities, but no one takes them as eyewitness testimony of gods walking the earth. The Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, meaning the authors had plenty of time to gather names from Jewish sources, oral traditions, and earlier documents. Luke himself admits he wasn't an eyewitness and relied on pre-existing accounts. Luke 1, verse 1 through 3. The authors didn't need to witness events to get names right. They just needed access to Jewish culture. The real sleight of hand here is confusing historical plausibility, the Gospels sound like they fit the time period, with historical reliability, whether the events actually happened. Using common names doesn't make the supernatural claims of Christianity any more believable. It just proves the gospel writers weren't completely ignorant of Jewish naming trends.
But with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
Okay, he's talking about the Gospel of Judas here. The Gospel of Judas was a theological text, not a historical biography like the Synoptic Gospels claim to be. It wasn't written to document historical events. It was designed to convey Gnostic philosophy. Treating it as if it's meant to be a rival history book is a category error. More importantly, the matching names equals reliability argument is a double-edged sword. If that logic were valid, then the Book of Mormon and the Quran, which also contain historically accurate names, must also be considered historically reliable. Greek myths mentioning real cities and rulers must also be considered historical records. The presence of later names in the Gospel of Judas does not disprove its theological claims, just as having first-century names in the New Testament does not prove miracles happened. This is just apologetics disguised as historical reasoning, a desperate attempt to undermine competing traditions without realizing the same logic cuts against their own.
That Luke has 19 names, 2 of which are completely unique, fits the data perfectly if we assume that Luke is actually describing real people in real places.
The reasoning here assumes Luke was writing history and then uses his own writing to prove that he was accurate. That's not evidence, that's self-confirmation. Many ancient texts use rare or unique names. Greek mythology includes highly specific Trojan names that fit historical data, but that does not prove the Iliad is a true account of the Trojan War. No external historical sources confirm the existence of Damaris or Lydia. The only mention of them is in the New Testament. This claim only holds weight if independent, non-Christian sources confirm these figures, which they don't.
That they're communicating a level of authenticity through their writings to make sure that you know they're talking about real people in real places at real times.
All right, here he's basically saying that when the authors are writing their biographies of Jesus, like Peter, Paul, Jude, and James are writing, they're showing authenticity by using real names and places, but here's the problem. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus, meaning authors could have researched historical names or used oral traditions to sound authentic. Using real names does not mean the events described actually happened. Historical novels do this all the time. There is no external evidence confirming that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John actually wrote the books attributed to them. The earliest copies of the Gospels are anonymous, and authorship was only assigned later by church tradition. This is an argument from authority, not Wes's authority, but the Bible's authority, assuming that because the text claims authenticity, it must be true. His entire argument conflates historical plausibility with historical accuracy, a classic apologetic tactic. Let's break it down. Yes, the Gospels use names that fit first-century Judea. No, this does not prove the stories actually happened. Yes, archaeology confirms that places like Jerusalem existed. No, this does not prove Jesus was resurrected. Throw in enough historical-sounding claims and hope the audience doesn't notice that none of it actually confirms the supernatural claims of Christianity. The New Testament can contain historically plausible names and settings, yet still be a theologically driven narrative rather than a factual eyewitness account. The mere presence of correct names does not equate to historical truth, just as the use of London and Scotland Yard in Sherlock Holmes stories does not make Sherlock Holmes a real person. This entire argument is a smokescreen designed to make the audience believe that historical details confirm divine truth, when in reality, they do not. I'm tired of debunking this. I've already spent enough time dismantling these claims, so I'm going to give a short summary of the rest of this and then tear it apart quickly. Wes spends a lot of time claiming that Luke accurately places his gospel within history by naming rulers, locations, and events. He argues that the gospels are more reliable than Tacitus. Yes, seriously, because Tacitus made mistakes, while Luke supposedly didn't. Then he brings up the Pilate stone, found in 1961, to claim that it proves Luke got Pilate's title right. Finally, he points to a 2nd century graffiti drawing, the Alexamenos Graffito, as evidence that early Christians worshiped Jesus as God. He wraps it up with the usual "the evidence is overwhelming" speech, implying that history supports Christianity even though faith is still required. The claim that Luke accurately places history, so his gospel is reliable, is deeply flawed. Writing about real people and locations doesn't prove supernatural claims. Historical fiction does this all the time. Naming real places and rulers doesn't mean miracles actually happened. More importantly, Luke contradicts Matthew on basic historical events such as who was ruling at Jesus' birth, Herod versus Quirinius. If Luke was so committed to getting history right, why can't he even agree with another gospel? Then there's the ridiculous claim that Tacitus made mistakes, but the Gospels got things right. Tacitus was a Roman historian, not a theologian. His job wasn't to understand Jewish messianic titles perfectly. Meanwhile, the Gospels contradict each other on basic facts, including the death of Judas, the women at the tomb, and even the timeline of Jesus' birth. So if slight errors disqualify Tacitus, what does that say about the Gospels? Go check out my Matthew Troll the Verse on my playlist. Just in the first 2 chapters, I show a ton of errors, and I haven't even gotten to the rest yet. Next, he tries to use the Pilate stone to prove Luke's accuracy, but the Pilate stone only confirms that Pilate existed. It says nothing about Jesus or the trial described in the Gospels. Archaeology can confirm a historical figure lived, but that doesn't mean everything written about them is true. If we apply this logic consistently, we'd have to believe that all the miracle stories written about emperors, kings, and religious figures are true just because those people existed. And then we get to the Alexamenos Graffito, which allegedly proves that early Christians worshipped Jesus as God. No, it doesn't. It proves that someone mocked Christians in the 2nd or 3rd century, long after Christianity had already developed its theology. If graffiti counts as proof, then we'd also have to take ancient pagan graffiti as evidence that their gods were real too. Finally, we get the grand conclusion: artifacts support the reliability of the New Testament. Yes, archaeology can confirm that cities existed, rulers reigned, and burial practices happened, but none of this proves supernatural claims. Just because the Bible gets some historical details right doesn't mean everything in it is accurate. By this logic, Harry Potter takes place in a real city, London, so I guess Hogwarts must be real too. After tearing apart these claims piece by piece, the verdict is clear. This entire argument is a house of cards built on rhetorical sleight of hand, cherry-picked evidence, and outright misdirection. Apologists like Wes Huff want you to believe that because the Bible contains real names, real locations, and historical rulers, it must be historically accurate. But this is textbook deception. Historical fiction, myth, and propaganda have used the same technique for thousands of years. No one believes that the gods of Olympus are real just because Athens and Sparta existed. Why should the Bible be treated any differently? The truth is, the New Testament was written decades after the events it describes by anonymous authors with clear theological agendas. We don't have the original texts, just copies of copies of copies, full of contradictions, forgeries, and later additions. The claim that it was faithfully transmitted is a sanitized version of reality, conveniently ignoring the thousands of textual variants, missing passages, and scribal errors that biblical scholars have openly acknowledged for years. And let's be honest, even if every single name and place in the Bible were historically accurate, that still wouldn't prove a single miracle happened. You can confirm that Jerusalem existed, but that doesn't mean Jesus walked on water. You can confirm that Pontius Pilate was a real person, but that doesn't mean he condemned the Son of God. You can find an empty tomb, but that doesn't mean a resurrection took place. It's designed to make believers feel secure while conveniently ignoring the actual historical and textual problems that scholars, secular and Christian, have pointed out for centuries. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've officially survived an onslaught of apologetic nonsense. If you enjoyed watching this entire argument get demolished, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what other religious claims you want me to dismantle next. I'm always up for exposing bad history and terrible arguments. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and don't fall for the bait.